No, we was down there, we were in Eden.
At this time, we'll call the special call meeting for the budget workshop to order. And at this time, I'll ask Commissioner Langley to do the invocation and Commissioner Rebholz to do the pledge.
Let us pray. Eternal God, our Father, we're grateful and thankful for the opportunity to continue to serve your people. Father, now touch our hearts and minds concerning what needs to be done for the citizens of this great county. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Please face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is any one of the commissioners have a conflict of interest concerning the budget workshop? Hearing none, need a motion to approve the agenda.
Motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All those in favor of the agenda, raise your right hand. Items for presentation. The first item is the property tax settlement. Lloyd?
How y'all doing? I hate to do this in a special session, but summer session of the Property Tax Commission is coming up, so I wanted to go ahead and get this out of the way, get this done. This is our last open real property one. Just briefly on it, super brief, it is actually a property that we're recommending and have spoke to the attorney for a value reduction. It's around about a 10% value reduction basically from what we've got in it currently. We're still going to be at or above what the reval value was on it, and we're going to $1,784,783. This is owned by Golden Arches Realty Corporation. Any questions on the property? Golden Arches, this is the McDonald's here in town. They did some work after the revaluation, a little bit of work inside the building, and one of our appraisers went up on the value, and they contested it was the income approach value and some other things. I agree. I mean, there's a lot to that. You do a lot of stuff to a business, it don't always go dollars to dollars, and look at the way the income works with that, I would say that's a fair value. So we went back to the revaluation value.
1.7 million.
Yes, sir. We're asking for $1,784,783, down from slightly below $2 million. Like I said, it's about a 10% drop in the base. What we're doing. We went up a little under $200,000 due to permitting.
That's your recommendation?
Yes, sir.
So moved.
Got a motion to accept. Is there a second? A second. Any more discussion? If not, all those in favor of the recommendation, raise your right hand. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, the second item is the manager's recommended budget. Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. You have the budget in front of you, the budget book in front of you, and by statute, I'm required to make a presentation to you. So I'll do that. I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you again for the fiscal year 22-23 recommended budget. All the board members have been through the budget process at least twice, I believe. So I'm not going to hit too much on that, but although, people will be watching this and want them to clearly understand how we do our budget. So as you'll recall, very quickly, we put the budget together in two parts, or in three parts actually. The first part is the continuation budget. That simply looks at what it takes to continue to do the exact services that we are performing this year in next year's budget. We present that to you. The second part of that has service expansions, so if there's anything new or different or anything that increases services or decreases services, we ask the department heads to come in individually and speak to you about that, because it is the board's budget and it is how you get done for your constituents what you want to get done. So we make those presentations to you, or they make those presentations to you. I generally handle just the general government ones that impact all of the county. It kind of keeps me out of the middle of playing favorites on service expansions. So they make those pitches to you directly, and then you get to decide whether you like those or not, or whether you want to fund those or not. And then the third part is simply the fee manual. And the fee manual is a part of the budget, which you set each year so that you're able to recover some of the fees from some of the direct services that are applied to citizens, so that those who are using those direct services are paying more for that, which would make sense. The budget is balanced, and it is prepared in accordance with the policies and procedures in the Local Government Budget and Fiscal Control Act, which is state law under General Statute 159. So the budget process began, as you know, with the budget planning process that the board started on January 27th at the board's retreat. This year there were a couple things at the retreat that you said you wanted to see in the budget that we put in there, and then were affirmed at some of the meetings afterwards. So we got to vote on those, and so we went ahead and put those in the budget. That's actually the first time we've actually done that, I think, since I've been here, that the board said ahead of time we want this in the budget. So I appreciate that direction, and that helps us tremendously. We present the budget tonight, the recommended budget tonight per statute, and then the board will have work sessions that will start Thursday, run through next week, and then also you'll have a final session in which you nail down the budget. You have to have, or you're required to have at least one public hearing on the budget. We have that scheduled for June the 6th, which is at your next regular scheduled board meeting. That gives the public the opportunity to comment on the budget and for you to take that into consideration. We have also then scheduled a special called meeting on the 9th for you to adopt the budget if you so choose. The board in previous years has also adopted the budget the night of the public hearing, but it's at the board's total discretion as to what you want to do. However, you have to have a budget adopted by June 30th. And I say this every year. You don't have to, but it is a good thing to have it adopted by June 30th. You could do there is a method in which you could do a continuation budget, but it's really ugly and really cumbersome and really messy. And so you would want to have that done by June 30th. As you'll see on page 2, we went back with those same goals that the board has always talked about, and that is to rely on financial plans and systems in our preparation for the proposed budget. We conservatively estimate revenues and expenditures to avoid expectations of performance that are not realistic. And as you know, sales tax for us has been all over the place. It's really difficult for us to predict, and again, we're in that same kind of boat. We take the best information we can get from the resources that are available to us. That's through the Association of County Commissioners and through the League of Municipalities. They both have folks who are forecasters, and they try to lay that out for everybody across the state so that when you make those decisions, you're making them based on an educated guess. We also try to create an atmosphere where efforts to spend down during the fiscal year are discouraged. We don't do our budgets like state budgets. We don't do our budgets like federal government budgets, where if you don't spend all your money, you don't get it next year. That style of budgeting causes department heads to say, I got to get that line item to zero by the end of the fiscal year. We don't want them doing that. If they need money for something to continue operations, then we want them to use it, but we don't want them to say, well, I've got to spend it to zero or I won't get it next year. And as you recall, if you've ever worked in state budgets or in federal budgets, that's the way it happens if you don't, because they're looking at the number. And they said, well, obviously, if you didn't spend it, you didn't need it. We want to make sure the departments have what they need to do what they need, but we don't want them spending down to zero if they don't have to. We also try to present a budget that reevaluates all the expenditures and the revenues and allows for policy review and potential service reductions or expansions based on policy directives. And those policy directives come from you, the board. And then also we try to provide an analysis of county government cost centers so that you can see directly and we can demonstrate where those general fund tax dollars are being spent and what the services you're receiving for those tax dollars. So an overview of the budget, the recommended budget, and everybody wants to know this right up front, the recommended budget maintains the tax rate at 62.5 cents for each $100 worth of valuation. At the assumed collection rate, that'll generate approximately $38.9 million in property tax revenues. And as you'll recall, the board actually reduced the rate by 1 cent last year in fiscal year 21-22. So it does maintain all county services and programs provided in the prior year, and it does establish 2 new board-approved programs. So that first program, let me back up. So it does that, and this is all done without a tax increase. We put in 2 new programs that are a little over $1.6 million. We've done that without a tax increase. in spite of the fact that we're close to a 40-year high for inflation and the continuing cost of that based on services for the next year. We've tried to anticipate what the costs are going to be in fuel, and as you know, we've got a lot of vehicles on the road. We're spending a lot of money on fuel, and as that goes up, we've tried to anticipate those. You'll see that the South Region CPI for the 12-month period as of April is 8.8%. So the inflation is there, it's clear. We've tried to anticipate that. What we've heard, both from the national side, and I was on a conference call last week with one of the forecasters from the General Assembly. They believe that inflation has peaked as of last month and that it is going to turn down, but that doesn't mean that it's going to go back to where it was. We're still going to be in this mess, at least what they're saying, through the end of the year. But they believe it's peaked and it's starting to turn down. You've seen that one little bump, that downturn. We'll see what the next month looks like. So the recommended general fund budget is $67.4 million. This is 6.8% greater than the original 21-22 budget, and that increase is driven by the board's establishment of the $1 million Beaufort Promise Community College Education Funding Program and the $746,000 Workers' Compensation Fund, and of course the increased operational costs due to the rising inflation. So we feel good that is a good number. That's a strong number. And we're pleased that we're able to do that and anticipate those costs and not have to recommend a tax increase. The recommended budget increases the K-12 public school system funding level over last year by $560,244, or about 3.4%. You've heard the finance officer talk about the sales tax that's dedicated by statute, is dedicated to the school system for capital funds. That's where that's coming in. The community college, you'll see in the budget, is decreased by $303,231, and that's related to your one-time funding from last year. You remember you funded them one time last year for the boat building, the startup of the boat building process, boat building curriculum. So that is where that decreases at, because that was a one-time funding. The $1 million Beaufort Promise program is a 4-year funding cycle with $250,000 allocated each year for that program, where they would use that. They would charge against that in our special revenue program, in our special fund, to provide community college education at no cost to folks in Beaufort County if they want to go to community college. The recommended budget continues to fund the Capital Improvements Fund with 1 cent of the projected property tax revenue. That was established by this board in the fiscal year 19-20 budget. So it essentially sets aside 1 penny and uses that 1 penny to fund capital improvement projects. For years, we kind of got a little behind on looking after our capital needs, and the board in 19-20 said we need to start a process to fix that. And you set aside 1 penny, and you'll see that recommendation on what that's for in the budget. The recommended budget also maintains prior year fire and EMS rates. Those are set each year, but there are no changes this year. The one thing that you will know about that and notice about it is you will see, and it's been advertised to the folks who live in Bath, the town of Bath asked, like we did a couple years ago with the town of Pantigga, if the county would assess that tax on our tax roll instead of the town paying us directly. So essentially, we are incorporating the town of Bath into the EMS district. Now, that is done through a very special process where we have to send out a notice to every property owner in the town of Bath. We have to have a public hearing. The town of Bath has already done a resolution asking that be done. And the reason they have to do that is because it is considered it's a special service district. And in a special service district, you have to have permission by statute. You have to have permission from the municipality to allow to tax in that for a special service district. So that's the way all of our EMS districts are funded. And so instead of Bath cutting us a check for the amount for 5 cents, they're simply saying, we want you now to levy that just like you do everybody else. Whether they pull that back off their tax roll, we'll see, but that's completely up to them. The recommended budget does increase the solid waste fee by $5 to offset the cost of increasing solid waste disposal and inflation. Obviously, there's a lot of costs associated with that. The disposal of solid waste continues to increase, the tonnage continues to increase. So that's $5 additional to try to help offset some of that. The recommended budget in the other enterprise fund of the water fund does not increase water rates overall, but it does make the final adjustments in the 5-year plan that the board put together to equalize the rates among all the districts. Because you remember at one time when the districts were set up, we had multiple rates across all the districts. The board several years ago looked at that and said we want to equalize all those rates so that we're charging one rate across all the districts, and we are now at the end of that 5-year period. So as of this budget, this recommended budget, all of those water rates are the same across all the districts. We again maintain the administrative charges to the enterprise funds to offset the cost to the general fund for providing those services, and that simply makes sense because there is time that is taken out of staff. There's staff time that's used for work in the enterprise funds. And if you did not charge the enterprise fund for that, then the general fund would be subsidizing it. So it simply makes sense that if I'm cost allocating my time against that enterprise fund ought to be paying for it because enterprise funds are designed to pay their entire share, their entire cost. The recommended budget does appropriate $1.6 million in general fund balance. $600,000 of that is being used to create a workers' compensation internal service fund, and the remaining $1 million is transferring to a special revenue fund to establish the Beaufort Promise Funding Program, scholarship program. So going to the general fund in detail, the general fund recommended budget is $67.4 million. It maintains the tax rate at 62.5 cents. The estimated total valuation in Beaufort County this year is $6.2 billion with a B. That's made up of $5.5 billion in personal and real property and about $633 million in motor vehicles. Collections for real and personal property taxes are assumed at 98.22% and at 100% for motor vehicles. You recall several years ago the state took over taxing motor vehicles. We used to tax them, and there were all these loopholes where people would get out of paying taxes. They'd move their titles around and their license plates around, and now the tax and tag program went in several years ago. So we're now able, anytime you do that, you've got to pay your taxes first. So the state did a really good job working with the association on that, and so we are now able to project that at 100%. The real and personal collection rate is up 0.22% from the prior audited period, and the Local Government Budget and Fiscal Control Act allows us to use that revenue calculation from the budgeted audit in fiscal year 2021 for our collection rate. So we're using 98.22%. And again, that's up 0.22% based on the efforts of the tax collector and his staff. 0.22% might not seem like a lot, but it is significant. And when you start getting that small of numbers, we're at 98.22, so there's not a whole lot left out there. And they'll continue to crunch that and get as tight as they can on it. So the estimated real property valuation is actually up 1.76% from the prior year. You'll see in the chart, we always show this to you every year, it's the 8-year historic tax rate per what fiscal year it was and what year that was in the revaluation cycle. So you'll see we're at 62.5 cents, recommended again in fiscal year 22-23. And then if you back up, where that was in the prior revaluation cycle is 53 cents. Again, the other thing that we want to show you every year is the sales tax ratio study. The Department of Revenue every year comes out with a sales tax or a sales ratio. And what that does is it looks at the market, it looks at what properties are selling for, and it determines what that is based on where you are in your valuation. So if it's 1, then market equals assessed value. If it's up or down, it allows you to take the sales ratio, multiply it times your tax rate, and get essentially an equivalent tax rate that can be spread across the entire state. Because in some instances you may be in year 1 of your revaluation, and you're a lot closer to market in year 1. If you're in year 7, you're probably not very close to market. We saw that a couple of years ago where it actually went reverse, and the market was lower than where we had it pegged. You peg it every 8 years. The board has changed now. You said you're going to start doing it every 7 years, but you peg that number one time in that 8-year period, and then the market does what it does. And typically, when you peg the number, the market continues to grow. Property appreciates. It doesn't depreciate. We saw it happen during the Great Recession. The property actually went down, so our market value stayed here, our assessed value stayed here, and actually the property decreased. It was unusual. That was really unusual. I've never seen that before, and people weren't really happy about that. People expect property to appreciate and grow in value. We're seeing that now. And due to market conditions, we're seeing that exaggerated. Our numbers were pegged, and what's going to happen is when market comes in now, with how hot the market is, it's going to be a lot higher. Now, when it's higher, then it essentially decreases the effective tax rate, because someone has a piece of property that's worth more. You still have it pegged at a lower value, so the difference there is essentially a difference in the assessed, the effective tax rate. So you'll look at our neighbors around us. Washington County, they have a tax rate last year of 85 cents per hundred. Their 2022 ratio is 0.9972, so they're below. So when you multiply the two, that means their tax rate is actually less, their effective tax rate is actually less. It's at 84.76%. Now, they are listed as the 97th highest tax rate in the state of North Carolina. So we show you this every year, and we show you what our neighbors are. And all of our neighbors, except for Craven County, have a higher effective tax rate than Beaufort County does. Based on the effective tax rates, and you look at ours at 62.5 cents, and the sales ratio of 0.8101, our effective rate is actually 50.63 cents per $100 worth of valuation. And that makes us the 37th lowest tax rate, effective tax rate in the state of North Carolina. Craven is only below us, his only neighbor below us, and everybody else around us is higher. So it gives us that apples to apples review. Projected sales tax revenues are up. $1.9 million, about 18.5% from prior year original. And we try to conservatively estimate those. Our efforts, just because we just get the information. We can plot historic trend lines, and we can anticipate what we think it might do, but we're kind of along for the ride when it comes to sales tax. We have projected this year, based on information from the League of Municipalities and the Association of County Commissioners, about a 3% increase in sales tax. Now, over last year, they were tremendous increases, but they're recommending about 3%, because obviously inflation is going to take a hit on that. People are going to stop buying as much as they are, especially with interest rates going up. So we anticipate that stabilizing. But again, we really don't know how that's going to go. We have projections, but we don't have the detail on that. So intergovernmental revenues, you'll see, are expected to increase by about $765,000 in the next year. That's due to EMS general fund tax revenues. Obviously, the tax valuation has gone up a little bit. So when we tax for EMS, that goes up a little bit, just based on value. There is some additional state and federal grant funding, and our ABC revenues are going back up. Licensing fees and general fund revenues are projected up $367,000. That's additional health-related grant funding and increased development associated with development fees with the building that's going on now. So the economy's pretty hot, the market's moving, so every time we send somebody out to do a building inspection and those kind of things, those numbers go up. Our investment earnings are projected to reach about $50,000. The rates are still low when historically, when you think about it, but that will change if rates continue to increase. Don't know where that's going to go. You read a lot of different things. I think the article I read today was they were modeling it after 1994, where the Fed came in and bumped the rates, and that was when Greenspan was there and bumped the rates 3 or 4 times, and projected they were going to have this nice soft landing, and everybody says you can't do it. You can't make a soft landing when you start doing things like that. So again, one of those things, we're kind of along for the ride, and we'll see how it goes. We do, like I said earlier, the recommended budget does appropriate $1.6 million in fund balance. $600,000 of that is for the Workers' Compensation Internal Service Fund, and then the $1 million for the Beaufort Promise. The $600,000 workers' compensation, there's fund balance money that's going into that, and then there's the projected savings that we will have off of our insurance. And what that means is we're taking a higher deductible. We brought that to you, laid it all out, and the board said, yes, go with that. So we're taking a $100,000 deductible on our workers' comp. We're essentially saying we're going to be on the hook for $100,000, the first $100,000 in workers' comp charges. Historically, we've been around $30,000 a year. We have had a year that's above that. We've had years that have been below that. It's a calculated risk, but what we've seen is that if we can take that, set it aside, and then you can take those savings and set those aside as well, which is what you're showing. That's why there's $700,000 in there, because we're taking the projected savings, $130-some thousand in savings, and adding that to the fund. You do that for a couple of years, and you build that fund up, and then you can set it aside and start charging against it, and then the savings you'll be able to use for other things. But it is there are no changes in our workers' compensation coverage, so there are no issues there. It's just we're taking the deductible. We're saying we're going to pay the first $100,000. Again, the Beaufort Promise is a 4-year. What we heard the board say when y'all were discussing this was, we like the idea of the Beaufort Promise to be able to do that. We're a little concerned that we want to be able to see how it works. We want to make sure that if we put money in, we can look at it and study it and see if it's working. So what we did in the recommended budget was we took a one-time appropriation of $1 million out of fund balance, set it aside in a special revenue fund, and then $250,000 each year they can draw against. And it may not be $250, it may be less than that. They may not have that much of demand for the program. I think they will have a pretty strong demand for the program, but we've set it up at $250,000 a year. And then that gives you 4 years worth of information that you can look at. The community college can study that. They can determine what it does, and if it's a good program. And then the board has the decision at the end of that funding cycle. Do you make another appropriation to that, or do you find a recurring revenue source? Because obviously if the program continues, it will be a recurring revenue expense or a recurring expense, and you will need to find a recurring revenue stream to deal with it. So as of June 30th, 21, the audited unassigned general fund balance was $24.8 million, or 41.82% of expenditures. And at the close of 21-22, it's estimated the unassigned general fund balance will be $26.9 million, or 42.36% of expenditures. Now, that's always a conversation the board has had about where you want to be. Your policy currently is 35%. And there's been discussion on the board about whether you want to bring that down, whether 35% is where you need it to be. We've tried to provide as much education as we can and show you all the numbers as to where that line lays out. On page 4 of the budget message, you'll see the pie chart we show you every year, which is where the anticipated revenue comes from. You'll see the largest, obviously, is out of property taxes. And then we'll go into the expenditures, and these are the general cost centers that we talk about. General fund budget cost center. Now we exclude debt service and transfers to other funds so that we're equal. Overall, the general government cost centers increased by 7.2%. Those drivers include increased maintenance costs due to inflation and supply chain issues, additional HVAC maintenance that's required due to the COVID mitigation equipment that was installed. We've got to change out those UV filters and a couple other things that adds to that cost. And then just there's the increase in the courthouse security contract. We had an increase in property and liability insurance. And this year, we're back to budgeting $100,000 in contingency. You'll recall, typically we budget $100,000 each year for contingency. Last year, the board took that out. We put it back in this year, just like we always do. So that's why you'll see that bump up, because it was taken out last year by the board. Health and Human Services, or Human Services cost centers, those cost centers increased overall by 5.1%, and that's driven increases in DSS and health, public health due to state program expenditure estimates. What you really want to look at is what are the county share dollars. I think that's where the board has always been interested in. And the county share dollars for DSS increased by 1%, so they were currently at 43% last year. They will be at 44% this year. And then public health has actually decreased, and that was at 45% this year, and it's now down, we're projecting it down at 39%. So there are less county dollars matching up against more state dollars, state and federal dollars, so that's a good thing. The increased expenditure in public health is mostly related to the additional no-match grant funding for substance abuse and community disease prevention programs. So there's a lot of money coming down on substance abuse that is no-match money from the county, so they're going to get that money to do those programs, and we don't have to match up county dollars against it. Education cost centers, again, the recommended budget here is up overall 3.1%. K-12 is funded at 3.4% above prior year, and the community college is decreased by 8.7%, but that is because of the one-time startup fees you had last year. Public safety cost centers are up 6.4% overall, and the main drivers there are increases in operational costs at the sheriff's office and jail due to inflation. We've returned the budget to a 10-vehicle rotation for the sheriff's office that was previously scheduled, so we've returned it to that. There's also a vehicle replacement and emergency management and some additional equipment cost and animal control. But overall, when you think about those departments, those public safety departments, where we have sheriff's office, we have deputies on the road, and we have ambulances on the road every day, an increase of 6.4% in an inflation period where we're at 8.8% is probably pretty good considering what gas costs have done. And we've anticipated those increased fuel costs into the new year, and a lot of that is taken up with that. There are additional costs we project in the jail we anticipate census going up there, additional meal costs and things like that. So. Then on page 6, you'll see the appropriations and the percentages there. In general, our education expenditures are typically always the greatest. That's 32% of your budget goes to education, 29% goes to human services, which is the large drivers are DSS and the health department, and then public safety at 24%, and then the remaining there. Your enterprise funds, we talk about the enterprise funds, are funds set aside, they're business-like services, water, solid waste, where the consumer is receiving something and they're being charged for that something, and you're doing that as best you can to recover all the costs associated with that something, instead of general programs that you have in the general fund where you're taking a tax collection and you're using that spread out across a lot of different programs where use may be different amongst different people. So the water fund recommended budget continues at $8.3 million. And we talked about that. You do have the completion of the rate study that consolidates all of those rates across the 7 districts into one uniform rate across all districts now. We do continue the 10-year capital improvement program across the water system that was established in fiscal year 18-19. There are $183,000 recommended in capital, and the contingency is funded at $28,000. Solid waste is recommended at $4.2 million. There is a $5 increase recommended for solid waste fees for a total of $175. That increase is required to pay for increased costs of disposal and inflation. We do, like I say, continue our administrative charges. There is a transfer of $50,000 to the solid waste fund balance, and the contingency is funded at $8,000. And that fund balance is there to help you be able to make additional fixes in that program. So overall, in summary, the recommended budget continues all prior year county services and operations and implements the 2 initiatives approved by the board, the Beaufort Promise and the Workers' Compensation Internal Fund. That is all done in this recommended budget without a tax increase and maintaining the tax rate at 62.5 cents in despite of anticipated record high inflation. Again, we do show a $5 increase in the solid waste fund. We'll make sure we're clear on that. The water fund does complete the 5-year rate consolidation. In keeping with our prior budget practices, with the budget is broken down in continuation and expansion, and the continuation budget projects a surplus. That surplus is a little over $1 million. And in my budget messages before, I've stayed away from it, but I call it out in this budget message in that I want it to be clear for the board, and I want to make sure I say that clearly. I think that you need to use a majority of that surplus to fund a significant COLA based on the 8.8% inflation that's happened over the last 12 months. If you don't do that, then all the work that the board has put in place over all these years to get us to a market rate, to get us where we're competitive, is going to be lost. So I think, we've shown you what it ranges from a 5% all the way to a 9%. But I think you really need to look hard at that. Every CEO, every board of directors across the United States is looking at what they can do to maintain their employees and keep their folks. I got a note today from the federal government talking about some of the ARPA stuff about making sure that you're looking after employees in a tight market where people are competing for employees. We just can't afford to get behind. And I think we have the opportunity to keep our employees somewhat whole, maybe not completely whole, but at least somewhat whole based on the surplus that's projected and at least a 5% COLA to try to help offset that 8.8% CPI over the last 12 months. We did talk, or the board talked about establishing a plan to help employees move through the pay plan at a more objective measure instead of a performance-based subjective measure. Heard that really clearly from the board, where we heard from you that you would entertain us bringing something back to you that was more objective than subjective. So what we have done is, and it's going to take us a little bit of time, it won't be in this budget, but we will bring it back to you because it's going to take us 2 or 3 months to get it all and do it right the way it needs to be done. But what we're looking at is educational attainment and training achievements that are very objective and that would bring value to the organization. And with that, then we would say, if you have this, then we would adjust your salary to this, based on this. That helps move employees through the pay range. It helps them be competitive. It helps us retain people. And it addresses the issue that this board has said, in that if you have an employee who's been here 20 years, they are more valuable to you than an employee who's been here a year. Not discounting the employee that's been here for a year, but it just makes sense that if you've got somebody with that institutional knowledge and has been here a while, they are essentially more valuable an employee, and you want to make sure you retain those employees. So that's another piece that would play into the 3 legs of the stool in the pay plan, the COLA, the longevity that the board has put in place that's very much appreciated, and then looking at this as a way to help employees move through the pay plan and address a lot of the compression issues that we have. As always, and I say this every year, but it's really going to be, this year is really going to be a test of that. Obviously, the performance of the state and local and world economies will impact this budget tremendously. It all depends upon where inflation goes. We currently sit at a near 40-year high, and we've tried to anticipate those impacts. Like I say, we've looked at what we've seen on estimated fuel cost and other things. Supply chain issues are still messing us up. Costs are extremely high based on that. We can't stop doing what we do just because the prices go up. We have to continue those operations, continue those services. So we've tried to anticipate that, and that's why you see this budget up a little bit more than it has been in the past years. I mean, typically we've tried to be 1 or 2%. We're a little bit higher than that, but I think we're good in that we're able to cover it with all that in place, and we've not recommended a tax increase. You've got some other folks who are doing that, and I think we're good to where we don't need to do that. Again, and I want to be really clear in speaking about staff. Finance Officer Anita Radliff and her staff have done an absolutely outstanding job in putting the budget together and creating a document that's informative and functional, that serves as a management tool and an outline for which the board can debate policy. And I really appreciate all the hard work they do every year. Likewise, department managers did exactly what they were asked to do. We asked them to bring back a budget that they analyzed to make sure if they could look for areas that needed to be decreased or areas that they felt they needed additional support in. They do an outstanding job when we lay those budgets out, and they work really hard at what they do, and I'm very pleased and proud to be able to work with every one of them. So that is the budget message that we are required to present. I look forward to having the budget workshops with you and going in detail on the budget book that you have. We will start Thursday night, and then we have 2 next week, and then I guess 2 the next week or 1 the next week after that. You have it on your schedule. Department heads will be here to answer any deep diving questions that Anita and I may not be able to answer. Anita can probably answer every one of them. But we will have the department heads if they're here to answer any questions that you may have specifically about certain things. Outside agencies will also be here again, or outside agencies will be back this year. You'll recall in the last couple of years due to COVID, we didn't have large groups in here. We will bring back those outside agencies in the service expansion piece. You've got several agencies. I think there are 27 general fund service expansions and 12 enterprise fund service expansions. So those agencies and department heads will come in. They'll pitch those proposals to you. You can ask them detailed questions. If you like it and you can find a way to fund it, you can do that. If you don't like it, then not. Again, it goes back to this budget is the board's budget. Once we put a recommended budget together for you, it is just that, our recommended budget. It's the board's budget to do what you need to do for your constituents and get done for your constituents what you want to get done. So, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the organization and to continue to work for you and bring you another year's budget. So, take any questions you may have, or we can go to we can wait till Thursday.
Question?
I just got one.
Yes, sir.
On this addition to the board discussion of establishing a pay continuation plan, you said this was just a study. Was any money allocated for it in this budget?
No, sir, not in this budget. We haven't done that because we don't really know what the number looks like yet. Okay. What we've asked our department heads to do is go back and look at educational attainments and training attainments that would bring value to their department. Now, that value may be different for one department to the other department. Now, overall, in a general government kind of sense, like you've seen with the sheriff's office and the board approved that. If you have an associate's degree, because it's not a required degree, okay. If you have an associate's degree, there's a bump in salary. If you have a bachelor's degree, there's a bump in salary. That overall for general government, for overall government, I think is a positive thing. Some of our positions require certain levels of education, but if they don't and someone attains a certain level of education, then that brings value to the organization. Okay. And it helps us to be able to say to that person, we appreciate what you're doing. It gives them critical thinking skills and all sorts of things that helps the organization. And we would want to reward that. And like I say, each department may be a little different. And we're looking at those. We've asked department heads to tell us what is it that brings value to your department and what is it going to take for us to recommend the funding on that, and how do we lay that plan out so that it is very objective, as I've heard the board, a couple board members say. We don't want things to be too subjective. We want them to be very clearly objective and to be able to say, did you do this or did you not do this, not how did it seem to you.
Now, is this just tied to associate degree or BS or?
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's the part that gives me the heartburn.
Yes, sir.
Because you take department heads, they go to classes all the time. And you take the low-level employees, don't get that opportunity to go as much. So that's what gives me the heartburn about this here.
Well, what we're trying,
But I'm going to be open-minded
Well,
about it.
I appreciate
Let's put
that.
it together, and then we'll talk about it some more.
Yes.
I mean, I'm trying to be fair here.
right, and we are too, because what we heard from the board was, we want you to be more objective.
But the thing about it is, what you look at, and they deserve it, don't get me wrong, 95% of our department heads is above the maximum right now.
Not above the maximum, no, sir.
But
Not above the maximum.
The minimum.
They are above the
midpoint. Midpoint.
I'd have to look at the actual numbers.
Well,
I
look
get
at it and
that.
bring that back so we can look at that. And the thing about it is you bring value to an organization when you lift the lowest people up instead of the top people down.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to get you see.
No, I hear that really clearly, and that's why we've asked our department heads to look at every position we have. And is there something that we can do to help bring value that people can say, well, I want to do that, or I want that opportunity, and to make that. You know, a lot of,
I promise you I'm going to be open-minded about it, but I'm going to still have some more questions.
oh, sure, absolutely, and I appreciate that, but like I said earlier, when you get to higher level positions, those educational requirements are required under the job description, so we wouldn't be adding for that.
And we are also paying them for their, already paid them for their experience.
Some of those, yes.
We have already paid them.
Some of those, absolutely.
Yes, we have.
Right. So, again, that's why it's going to take us 2 or 3 months to put all this together, because we want it to be a hand-in-hand with the board so that we can come forward together on something that makes sense, that helps advance our employees through the pay period. Because when you think about where employees should be, after 7 to 8 years, an employee really ought to be about minimum, because, midpoint. Because at midpoint, you're considered an employee who can handle everything related to your job and do all the things that you need under your job. And in 7 to 8 years, you ought to be at that point. But under our pay structure, we don't have the criteria, we don't have the ability to advance people through the pay period or through the pay scale up to that. So we get a lot of folks that are compressed up against each other. And you do that sometimes by merit. We've heard very clearly from the board that they don't like merit. So we've tried to work on a way that we can be very objective about it and still help advance people through that, because that's how we keep good people, and it's how we bring more value to the organization and do that.
I'm going to be open-minded.
Thank you.
My last point is, I want to ask you another question. This is the second time, I looked on your presentation here, this is the second time that you put us on a 10-car rotation.
It is.
The last time, it didn't work out too good.
Right.
And we had to eat crow. What's in there this time to say that we won't have to do that again?
There's nothing in there that says you won't have to do that again.
Now, if we go buy 10 cars and want to buy 10 cars and don't give raises.
Well, so correct. So the reason we moved back to that was there was funding that was originally assigned to some vehicles that we weren't able to do based on receipts. So the board approved some radio stuff. So
And you put together a pretty good budget summary here, but I just, things that we plowing over again, I hope you don't have to do it a second time. That's all I worry about.
I understand. I think that was our original commitment at one time, there was a gentleman's agreement that if we got to 10, we could stay at 10, because from a county administration side, it helps us when we're able to keep funding levels fairly consistent instead of seeing spikes every time we buy a bunch of vehicles and then go 4 or 5 years and a big spike every time we do it. So if we can get them kind of leveled out, it helps us, and that's why we do that. But we're certainly, again, this is our recommended budget to the board, and it's ultimately the board's budget, and we're willing to work with you in any way you want to do it.
I appreciate the work that you've done. I mean, you can just say you put it together, but I just want to be clear that we're plowing ground that we have plowed before, and I don't want to do it again.
I understand. And there have been a lot of folks who worked really hard to put this thing together, so I want to make sure that those folks are acknowledged from the finance department all the way down to the department heads, and their folks that they've worked with, so.
Hood? Well, since this has come up, I'd like to request the sheriff send us the number of surplus vehicles that he has. I know there are 10 parked in his storage facility.
Okay.
And there's probably 8 or 10 back here behind us. He could have as many as 20 surplus vehicles right now because we got talked into going along with buying 4 or 5 new cars that have just been delivered. So there's a surplus of cars in the sheriff's department. We don't need to be spending any more money for that.
We'll be glad to get that information.
Okay, we'll recess until,
Got one.
okay.
You mentioned earlier, a few moments ago, that one of the biggest problems we have is inflation. 8.8%, I believe you said.
Last number was
It could be more than that by the time we finish this budget process.
We hope not.
But it very well could be. And the inflation is because of one thing and one thing only. Government has been allocating funding that we do not have. They'll give you a myriad of excuses why, but a lot of money has been spent to fund projects that don't need to be funded. In other words, government is a very poor allocator of wealth. To that extent, I think the money that we have stored in excess of what we've had since I've been a commissioner, that money would be better spent going back to the public. To that extent, I will argue that we need to return 10% of the funds. We need to reduce the tax rate by 10%. We don't need to return anything. We need to reduce the tax rate by 10% this year. That is my long-range plan for 12 months. Give the money back to the people. They are a better allocating source of their own funds than we could ever be.
Is that a motion or?
I will put it as a motion.
Second.
And if it doesn't pass tonight, I will bring it up again as we look at our budget and try to cut, because quite frankly, we need to do that because a lot of families are going to be cutting. A lot of families won't be spending money because they won't have money. There's an 8.8% tax that's being placed upon them every day, and it's going to go up.
Can I ask a clarification?
Yes,
You're saying 10% or 10 cent?
10%. 10% of what we would spend.
10%
Excuse me, of the ad,
what you mean?
yeah, of the ad valorem tax.
Present tax
Of the, excuse me, of the ad valorem tax. Thank you.
But it be reduced by 10%,
10%.
is that what you mean?
Yes, in other words, if you put a rough figure of 60 cent out there, it would be 54 cent.
Yeah, 63 and a half, 10% of that.
60, it's currently 62 and a half.
62 and a half?
So go back to 52.
No, that'd be more like about 55.
10%.
Any comments?
So let me just say that to you. Generally for us, 1 penny, so you're saying about 6 cents is essentially what you're saying. So in round numbers, 1 penny for us is about $600,000. So that's $3.6 million, right? Six times 6 is about $3.6 million you would look to cut out of the existing budget.
No, that's not what he said.
Yeah, you would be looking at a tax rate of roughly around 57 cents.
No, he's only addressing, my motion only addresses the tax rate, the present tax rate. Take 10% of that would be the tax rate for the coming year.
Yes, sir. No, I understand what you're saying. You're saying,
We're not talking about reducing spending yet.
well, you would have to, because you have to have a balanced budget.
Well, but the 10% would come out of fund balance. That money would come out of the fund balance.
Yes.
$24 million in fund balance.
Turn the mic over.
$24 million in the fund balance, it would come out of the fund balance.
Okay, so, and we've had we've had this conversation, and I will say it again, just to make sure. Our recommendation to you would be that if you are going to cut a tax rate, that is a recurring reduction. So you would need to make a recurring expenditure reduction as well. Otherwise, you're taking one-time money and using it for recurring expenses. You don't want to do that.
No, that's not a recurring expense, because the commissioners set the tax rate every year.
They do.
So we would set the tax rate this year at this. We would look at the tax rate again next year, and if it needed to be increased, you would increase it. That's just good business.
I hear what you're saying.
Would you like me to restate the motion?
I got your motion, but who said he had one too?
No, I seconded his, motion.
I got it.
Well, we're explaining how this would work. And the money is there to do the reduction this year because we've been overtaxing people. That is proved by the fact that we've had these surpluses over and over and over, aside from the fact that we have a fat budget. So this would be a good year to do this with inflation raging like it is. You know, I would remind you, you've got an 8% increase in spending in this budget. We haven't even looked at that yet.
Okay. It's very early. I mean, we've not even gone through the budget to determine where we're going. So I'm going to oppose the motion. All those, any other discussion? Okay. All those in favor of the motion, raise your right hand. Those opposed?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I make a motion that this don't be brought back up in 6 months.
No.
You can't do that on this. This is
I
a
can do it,
budget.
this is a
Wait a minute.
budget.
The tax rate
What do
is
the
a part
rules
of
say?
the, okay, go ahead and violate state law. We'll be
It
calling
ain't-
Raleigh and they'll let you know how it works.
No, our rules say that as long as I make it within this meeting, I can't make it tomorrow.
What I'm saying is your rules violate the state law on us doing a budget and doing the considerations we need to do. Go for it. We'll let the state treasurer tell you how it really works.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to We're going to recess until Thursday night, and our time is 5 o'clock. Is that correct, Katie? 5 o'clock. So,
Not 5:30.
have an enjoyable evening.